I saw him arrive and I laughed. Had I known then what I know now, I would have run, not from him, from myself. Julia, Duchess of Wyndham. The morning light came in sideways through the tall windows of Wyndham Hall, soft and silver, turning the room into something that felt like a memory before it had finished happening. Julia sat at the writing desk in the corner, the one that had become hers. Though the house still surprised her sometimes, still felt like a place she was discovering rather than inhabiting, and held a letter in both hands without reading it. She didn't need to read it. She had written it herself 3 years ago, never sent it. The paper had yellowed at the edges. The ink had faded just enough to look like something whispered. But the words were there. She could feel them even with her eyes closed. I was wrong about you from the very first moment. I was wrong about everything. Outside, hooves on gravel, a door closing below. His voice, low, giving some instruction she couldn't make out, and her chest tightened in a way she had stopped trying to name a long time ago. She folded the letter back along its old creases, tucked it into the small wooden box beside the inkwell, closed the lid. Then she let herself remember. It had started, as the worst and best things in her life had started, with a laugh. Her laugh. London, Covent Garden, September 1814. The morning had been Julia's idea. That was the detail she would return to later, in the long quiet hours after everything changed. She had been the one to suggest the market. She had pulled Charlotte by the arm and said, "Come, it's early, no one will see us," and Charlotte had laughed and agreed, and so they had gone. Covent Garden in September smelled of rain-wet stone and chrysanthemums and something warm underneath, bread or roasting chestnuts from a cart 3 stalls down. The sky was unpolished silver, not quite grey, more like light trying to decide whether it wanted to exist today. Julia walked with her hands tucked inside her pelisse, her bonnet slightly crooked, because she had put it on herself rather than letting her maid do it. Small disobediences, small freedoms carved into the edges of a life planned without her input. She was 19, the daughter of the Earl of Ashford, the most eligible young woman in half of London according to her mother, who announced this at breakfast with the regularity of a weather report. And she was here at 7 in the morning, pretending to care about the price of lavender, because it was the only hour of the day when she could simply be a person rather than a name attached to a dowry. Charlotte was ahead of her, pausing at a flower stall, pale roses, something purple she couldn't name, and Julia slowed without meaning to. That was when she saw him. He stood at the next stall along, slightly apart from the small cluster of early shoppers, studying a bundle of wildflowers with the unhurried attention of a man with nowhere he needed to be. His coat was dark, not in the way that rich men's coats were dark, not deep navy wool cut by a Savile Row tailor. This was darker in a simpler way, a little worn at the collar, the kind of coat that had seen several winters and didn't mind. He was tall, still among moving people in a way that made the stillness visible, the way a stone in a stream is visible not because it moves, but precisely because it doesn't. He held the flowers carefully, not loosely the way men held things they didn't intend to keep, but deliberately, turning the stems slightly in his fingers, the way someone handled a thing they had already decided to carry home. The flower seller said something to him. He responded, he smiled. Julia couldn't hear the words, too far away. But she caught the smile, and it was the kind of smile that was not performed for anyone. It arrived and departed quickly, private and unguarded, belonging entirely to him and to whatever the flower seller had said, and to no one else in the market. That was what made her keep looking. Not the height, not the coat, the smile that didn't know it was being watched. She looked away. Then she looked back. Still there, still considering the flowers, his head tilted very slightly to one side. His profile, she searched for a word and settled on composed. Every line of him composed, even here, even in a morning market with wildflowers in his hand and a coat that had known better decades. There was something about him she couldn't locate, something that sat wrong with the coat, wrong with the simplicity of his presence here, in a market alone, at this hour. Like a word in a sentence that didn't belong to the sentence, but somehow made the sentence better. She leaned toward Charlotte and dropped her voice to the register reserved for observations not intended to be kind. What a curiously ungraceful man. She had meant it as a mild observation, the kind of comment that dissolved into a giggle between friends and was forgotten by lunchtime, the kind she made a dozen times a day without thinking, because the world was full of things worth noticing, and she noticed most of them and said half of what she noticed, and that had always seemed like reasonable restraint. Charlotte turned, already smiling. "Where—" And then Julia felt it. Not a sound, not a word. A shift in the air. The particular stillness that happens when someone becomes aware of being watched. She had felt it before, at parties, at dinners, in drawing rooms full of people assessing her. But this was different. This came from one direction only, and it arrived without the heat of appraisal. She turned her head and he was looking at her. Not with offense, not with the cold affront of an injured man, not with the particular wounded pride of someone who had been publicly diminished. Just looking. His eyes were dark, dark enough that she couldn't read the color at this distance, only the steadiness. The complete, unhurried steadiness of someone who had heard exactly what she said and had decided, in the space of a breath, what to do with it. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he inclined his head, small, precise, like a man acknowledging a point made in an argument, and returned his attention to the flowers. As though she were a minor weather event, as though she was something to be noted and then set aside without damage. Heat climbed the back of Julia's neck. He heard me. She knew it without evidence. The certainty settled into her chest and refused to leave, the way certain embarrassments do, not sharp, not devastating, just persistently present, like a stone in a shoe. Charlotte was speaking, something about roses or the price or the color of something, and Julia nodded without hearing any of it. Her eyes kept returning, in small, guilty glances, to the man at the flower stall. He had turned back to the flowers entirely. He wasn't looking at her. He showed no signs of having been affected by the exchange. He paid for the bundle, unhurried, exact, without checking the coins in the way of someone unaccustomed to handling them, and tucked the wildflowers under his arm and walked away. No hurry, no backward glance, no performance of indifference, just a man with flowers absorbed back into the morning crowd as though he had never been there at all. Julia watched the space where he had stood until Charlotte's hand closed around her arm. "Julia, you've gone quite strange." "I'm perfectly well," she said. She was not perfectly well, but she was not able to say precisely what was wrong, which was itself a kind of wrong she was not accustomed to. She could usually name things. She was good at naming things. It was one of the things she was quietly, privately proud of. The ability to look at a situation and locate its center quickly and clearly, to say, this is what this is. But this, the dark eyes, the composed profile, the smile that hadn't known it was being watched, the way he had looked at her and then simply returned to the flowers. She couldn't locate the center of it, couldn't find the clean edge of it. It sat in her chest without a name, and she carried it through the rest of the market without being able to set it down. The carriage home was warm and close-curtained against the October chill, the sound of London outside muffled to a low, continuous murmur. Charlotte talked about the flowers she had bought, about a dinner she was dreading, about a bonnet she had seen at the milliner's on Bond Street. And Julia sat across from her, with her hands folded in her lap, and made the small sounds of a person who was listening. She was not listening. She was in the market, still, watching a man pick up a bundle of wildflowers with the care of someone who intended to keep them. What a curiously ungraceful man. The words came back to her with a clarity she found disproportionate. She had said unkind things before, wittier things, sharper things, things that had made Charlotte laugh until she pressed a hand to her ribs, and none of them had stayed with her like this. None of them had replayed themselves with quite this quality of sound, as though she were hearing them the way he had heard them, from the outside of her own voice, which was an unpleasant and illuminating experience she was not eager to repeat. He had not looked angry. That was the thing she kept returning to, pressing gently, the way you pressed something you weren't sure was bruised. He had not looked angry or wounded, or even particularly surprised. He had looked at her the way someone looked at something they had already accounted for, already considered, already placed in the correct position in some internal arrangement she had no access to. As though he expected it, she thought, and then as though he already knew me well enough to expect it. Which was impossible. She had never met him. Who was he? A clerk, perhaps. A schoolmaster. A curate from some damp parish who had come to London for the season on a thin income and a worn coat, and whatever quiet purpose brought men like that to Covent Garden at 7 in the morning. Someone, clearly, who was nobody, or nobody she would encounter again in any room that mattered. The thought should have been settling. It wasn't. Nobody she would encounter again. She turned her face to the carriage window and watched the London streets pass and pressed her lips together and told herself firmly that the slight, unnameable discomfort of the morning was simply the discomfort of being caught in a small unkindness, and that everyone was caught in small unkindnesses from time to time, and that by tomorrow she would have forgotten his face entirely. She almost believed it. They were home by 10. By noon she had repeated this to herself 3 more times with diminishing conviction. At luncheon, her mother talked about the Pemberton ball and the importance of the right gloves and whether the ivory pair or the cream pair were more appropriate. And Julia said the ivory, I think, at the correct moment, and moved her fork through her food and thought about dark eyes and an unhurried walk and a coat with a worn collar. By afternoon, she had moved on to, it doesn't matter because I will never see him again. By evening, it doesn't matter at all. At dinner, her father ate quietly at the head of the table in the way he ate when he was thinking about something other than food. Her mother planned the week. The candles burned steadily in their holders. The house was orderly and warm, and exactly what it always was. Julia moved her fork through her soup and watched the light shift on the wallpaper and felt, somewhere underneath the ordinary surface of the evening, the faint, persistent presence of something she could not name and could not put down. She went to bed early. She lay awake in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her. The smile that hadn't known it was being watched. The flowers held with deliberate care. 2 seconds of eye contact, and then the precise inclination of a head, and then nothing. Just a man returning his attention to wildflowers as though she were the least important thing in the room. As though she were something already understood. I will never see him again, she told the ceiling. It doesn't matter. She believed it then. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Julia knew something was different from the way her father held the envelope at breakfast. He didn't open it immediately. He turned it over, set it beside his teacup with the deliberateness of a man arranging his own thoughts. Her mother watched him from the other end of the table, with an expression Julia had spent 19 years learning to read. Anticipation dressed as patience. What is it? Julia asked. Nothing that requires your attention at this hour, her father said, which was precisely the answer that required her attention at every hour. She finished her tea. She excused herself. She waited. She was good at waiting. She had been trained to it the way young women of her station were trained to everything. Patience presented as virtue, functioning as constraint. You waited in drawing rooms. You waited for introductions. You waited to be told who you were going to become. Her maid came at 10:30. Miss Julia, your father is asking for you in the study. The study smelled of old books and pipe smoke, and the particular weight of decisions made inside it over generations. Her father stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the grey October garden. He didn't turn immediately. Close the door, Julia. She did. Sit down. She sat. Her father turned from the window, grey at the temples now, but still carrying himself with the straightness her mother called dignity and Julia privately called armour. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, unusual enough that her fingers tightened in her lap. I have arranged your marriage, he said. She had expected this sentence at some point in her life. She had known it was coming the way you knew winter was coming, inevitably, and somehow still surprising when it arrived. To whom, she asked, steadier than she felt. The Duke of Wyndham. She turned the name over in her mind. Wyndham, powerful, old, an estate in Somersetshire she had never seen. The previous Duke had died 3 years ago. She didn't know the son. I am not acquainted with him, she said carefully. So you will be. Her father moved to his desk. The formal announcement will be made at the Pemberton ball. You will meet him before then. When? Tomorrow. One night to prepare herself for the man who would become her life. What is he like? She asked. Her father was quiet, that waited quiet again. He is direct, he said, and private. He does not perform. A strange description. Julia filed it away. Does he know about me? He requested you specifically. A pause. He has refused 3 other arrangements over the past 2 years. This is not something he entered lightly. Requested specifically. Refused 3 others. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled. She settled on unsettled. Why me? She asked. Her father looked at her. Something moved through his expression, brief, unreadable. That, he said, is a question you should ask him yourself. She didn't sleep well that night. A man she had never met, who had apparently decided she was worth marrying, who had refused others before her. She turned it over, looking for the shape of it, and couldn't find one. She did not think about the market. She did not think about wildflowers or a worn coat, or dark eyes holding hers across a crowded morning. She did not think about any of that. He arrived at 2:30. Julia heard the carriage on the front drive, wheels on gravel, unhurried. She was sitting with her mother in the front drawing room, her embroidery untouched, her hands too still for anything but deliberate stillness. Her mother was talking about arrangements, etiquette, first impressions. Julia nodded at what she hoped were the appropriate intervals. The butler's voice in the entrance hall, her father's voice. Footsteps approaching, the door opening. Julia stood. The world quietly rearranged itself. He was tall. The coat was different, navy, perfectly tailored, but the way he wore it was the same composed quality to every line of him, the same unhurried presence, as though he had never in his life rushed toward anything because he had learned that rushing changed nothing that mattered. He looked at her. And she knew. Before he said a single word, in her chest, in the sudden silence inside her own head. The man from the market. The wildflowers, the worn coat. What a curiously ungraceful man. His eyes finding hers across the stall, the precise inclination of his head. He heard me. He has always known. Lady Julia, her father said, may I present Alexander Devereux, Duke of Wyndham? Alexander looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. The composure was intact. Of course it was. But at the corner of his mouth, so small she might have imagined it, was the shadow of something that wasn't quite a smile. The expression of a man who had been waiting for a scene to reach a particular page. Lady Julia, he said, low, unhurried, it is a pleasure. Julia's mouth opened. She closed it. He knows I know, and he is not going to say a word about it, she said in the voice trained for exactly these circumstances, gracious, steady, giving nothing away. Your Grace, the pleasure is mine. The lie tasted like ash. And his eyes said he knew that too. There was a protocol to these things. In the blue drawing-room of Ashford House, with her mother near the window and the butler at a respectful distance, the protocol was airtight. Tea, weather, the Pemberton ball, whether the autumn season had any theatrical performances worth attending, and underneath all of it, like a current beneath a frozen river, the thing neither of them named. You heard me. In the market, you heard every word. She couldn't say it. He wouldn't acknowledge it. So they sat on opposite sides of a tea service and were perfectly civilized, and the whole time, the silence between their words was louder than the words themselves. He was, she decided in those first 20 minutes, the most controlled person she had ever met. Not cold. She knew cold, her Aunt Genevieve, who operated with the warmth of a marble floor in January. This was different. Control that came from the inside, not from the surface. The difference between a locked door and a door built without a handle. He answered her mother's questions with precision, neither curt nor verbose. He accepted a second cup of tea. He expressed an opinion on the proposed poor law reforms that made Julia look up sharply. More specific, more generous than she had expected. Not the polite blandness of a man performing adequacy. An actual opinion held with actual conviction, stated without apology and without performance. She found herself listening more carefully than she had intended. At one point her mother rose to speak to the butler, something about a tray, and for a few seconds they were, in any meaningful sense, alone. The shift was immediate. Not that he changed, he didn't. But the space between them contracted slightly, the air reorganizing itself around the absence of her mother's voice. He looked at her, the way he had in the market, steady, present, unhurried. She held his gaze. She was determined to hold it. You are very composed, Lady Julia, he said. Something underneath the words, warmth or amusement, she couldn't tell which. I have had practice, she said. At composure? At sitting very still in rooms I didn't choose to be in. She hadn't meant to say that. Not so precisely. Not in a way that exposed the seam of it. His jaw shifted, barely. The very edge of his attention sharpening, the way a man sharpens when something surprises him and he doesn't intend to show it. I didn't choose many rooms in my life either, he said after a moment. And then her mother returned, and the conversation became weather again. She turned those words over that evening, sitting at her desk, the candle burning low, London quiet outside the window. I didn't choose many rooms in my life either. What did a duke, young, powerful, in possession of more rooms than she could count, mean by that? It was not the statement of a man performing humility. It had come out too quietly, too precisely, the way things came out when they were true rather than curated. She wrote it down on a loose sheet. In handwriting she folded into quarters and slipped between the pages of a book she was certain no one in this house had ever opened. She didn't know why she kept it. She told herself it was simply to process, the way you wrote something down to stop it turning in your mind. But the truth, which she didn't look at directly, was that she was beginning to collect him, small pieces, a precise tilt of the head, a question about the difference between admiring and feeling, a statement made quietly to no one in particular, in a room full of protocol, that sounded like the first honest thing said in it in years. She lay awake and thought about the jaw shifting and the way he had said those words, and she felt the particular irritation of someone who had decided in advance how a situation would feel and found it considerably more complicated than planned. The engagement notice appeared in the social pages on a Thursday morning. The Earl of Ashford is pleased to announce the engagement of his daughter, Lady Julia Ashford, to Alexander Devereux, Duke of Wyndham. She put the paper down. Her mother was smiling. Her father was watching her. "How do you feel?" her father asked. Unusual enough that she looked at him properly before answering. "Curious," she said honestly. He nodded slowly. "That may serve you well." The Pemberton ball was 3 nights later. The carriage arrived at 8:30. Julia sat beside her mother in the dim interior and watched the lamplight of Mayfair pass in amber intervals through the window and adjusted her gloves, the ivory ones, which had been the correct choice, and breathed the particular breath of someone who has prepared thoroughly and is still not entirely prepared. She knew what tonight required. She had known since the announcement. They would be watched, she and Alexander, with the specific appetite of a society that consumed beginnings, that needed to see, with its own eyes, the two people standing together to decide whether the thing between them was real or merely arranged. She knew what arranged looked like. She had watched other engagements, other couples at other balls, the way they stood 6 inches too far apart, the way their smiles arrived a half-second after they should have, the way their eyes moved anywhere except toward each other, the architecture of obligation. She wondered what she and Alexander would look like, from the outside. She wondered whether she wanted to know. Pemberton Hall blazed. Every chandelier lit, the light falling in cascades across 200 people in their finest, silks and sapphires, and the warm smell of beeswax candles and something floral that came from the arrangements banked against the far wall. The musicians were already playing, a gentle underscoring for the business of entrance and greeting, and the first careful moves of an evening not yet fully committed to itself. Julia moved through it with her parents, receiving congratulations with the appropriate warmth, saying the appropriate things to the appropriate faces. "How wonderful." "Yes, quite recently." "Thank you. You are very kind." The words came automatically, leaving the rest of her mind free to do what it did at every social event. Observe. The room told her things. Lady Pemberton near the entrance, whose smile reached Julia's face but stopped short of her eyes. Residual disappointment, perhaps, on behalf of the younger daughter, whose name Julia had not yet connected to anything specific, but would later connect to everything. 2 women by the refreshment table, whose conversation ceased at Julia's approach and resumed a beat too late, behind fans that did not quite conceal the direction of their glances. A man in yellow breeches near the far column, broad, well-dressed, with the particular ease of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in a room, who watched her arrival with an expression she couldn't fully read, but filed away without looking at directly. And then she found Alexander, near the tall windows, speaking with another man she didn't recognize. Black and white, the simplest combination in the room, and somehow the most visible for it, which she suspected was not accidental. A man who could command attention by refusing to compete for it. He saw her before she reached him. Across 20 feet of candlelit ballroom, through 200 people in motion, his attention found her with a directness that still, even now, cost her something to receive. Not because it was uncomfortable, because it wasn't. Because it was instead the feeling of being located, of being the specific point in a room that someone had already decided to move toward. He excused himself from his companion, crossed to her with unhurried steps, offered his arm in the formal way. She took it, and they turned together to face the room. She felt it immediately, the shift in attention, the reorientation of 200 pairs of eyes toward them, and then politely away, and then back again. The thing a newly announced couple produced in a room, a small, collective appetite for data. Were they well matched? Did they look at ease? Was there something there? Or was this simply 2 names and 2 estates and a solicitor's arrangement dressed up in ivory gloves and black wool? "You look," Alexander said low enough for only her, "as though you are preparing for battle." "Isn't that what this is?" "A performance, I've always thought, which is somehow both better and worse." She glanced at him sideways. "Do you perform often?" "Not if I can avoid it." "And tonight?" "Tonight I have very little choice. No self-pity, just truth stated plainly and then set down." Julia's grip on his arm eased slightly. Not releasing, just easing. The way muscles ease when they stop bracing for impact that doesn't arrive. They began a slow circuit of the room. She smiled when required. He inclined his head when required. Between requirements they were quiet, and she noticed, with the part of her mind that was always noticing, that the quiet between them was different from the quiet she maintained with other people at these events. With others, she managed silence, monitored it, shaped it, prepared to fill it at the first sign of strain. With him, it simply existed, like weather, like a room one actually lived in rather than performed in. She didn't fill it. Neither did he. Halfway around the room, a woman whose name Julia knew but whose face she could never attach to it correctly, stopped them with a wide smile and a volley of questions about the engagement, the timing, the plans, whether they had already visited Wyndham Hall, and Julia answered with the appropriate warmth and felt the entire time Alexander's arm steady under her hand. Not tense, not impatient. Just there, present in the way he was always present, as though he had decided at some point that being somewhere meant actually being there, fully, without reservation. When the woman moved on, Julia exhaled without meaning to. Endurance, Alexander said quietly, is underrated as a social skill. She pressed her lips together against a smile. You do it very well. Years of practice, he said, and the echo of her own words from the drawing room, I have had practice, landed between them without being spoken, and she felt him feel it too. They reached the far end of the room near the musicians, and he slowed and she slowed with him, and they stood for a moment at the edge of things, the music close enough to feel in the chest, the crowd behind them, the tall windows dark with October night ahead. You're not going to say it, she said. Say what? Entirely even. You know what? A precise pause. Yes, he said, I know what. And? He turned to look at her fully. Beneath the composure, something careful and genuine, something she was beginning to learn to look for in the places where other men wore their feelings openly, and he wore them only in the spaces between words. And, he said quietly, I think we should dance. She stared at him. He held out his hand. Behind her, the musicians shifted into a new piece, a waltz, slow and deliberate, built for two people who needed to be close without having chosen to be. She had danced at every ball since her come-out. She knew the mechanics of it completely, the hand placement, the distance, the way you moved within the form without touching it too closely, the art of being in someone's arms without being in someone's arms. This was different. His hand at her waist was light, correct in every technical sense, but she was aware of it with a precision she was not accustomed to, aware of the exact pressure of it, the warmth through the fabric of her dress, the way he held her with the same quality of care he had used in the market with the wildflowers, deliberate, decided, not incidental. She kept her eyes at the level of his shoulder for the first turn, then the second. On the third, she looked up. He was already looking at her. Of course he was. He had probably been looking at her since the first step. He looked at things with his full attention and apparently saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Up close, closer than the drawing room had permitted, closer than the formal calls, she could see things she had only approximated from a distance. The line of his jaw, the slight shadow beneath his eyes that spoke of someone who slept less than he should. The way his expression, even in stillness, held a quality of active consideration, as though he was always, quietly, thinking. You're counting steps, he said. I'm not. Here you are. You look at your feet when you count. I was not looking at my feet. You were looking at my shoulder, which is the same thing at a greater distance. Julia met his gaze directly. Her chin came up slightly, an involuntary thing, the reflex of someone who did not enjoy being read accurately. And where should I be looking? Wherever you like, he said. I was simply observing. You observe a great deal. I find it more useful than performing. And what have you observed, she said, so far this evening? A pause. They turned through the outer edge of the floor, and she caught, in the peripheral sweep of the movement, the man in yellow breeches again, watching from the column. Not them specifically, she thought, him specifically. The expression on the man's face had a quality she couldn't name but recognized, the look of someone calculating something. She filed it, returned her attention to Alexander. I have observed, he said, that you have already identified every person in this room who means you something other than goodwill. Her breath caught very slightly. Have I? The woman by the entrance, the two near the refreshments, the man at the column. She looked at him. So filed each one, he said, in under 5 minutes, without appearing to. The music moved around them, the candles, the 200 people and their particular hungers. You were watching me watch them, she said. Yes. Why? He held her gaze. Something in his expression, not the careful, alive quality she had seen in the drawing room, but something closer to the surface, something that cost him slightly more than usual to let be visible. "Because, he said, it confirmed something I already believed." She wanted to ask what. She didn't ask. The music shifted into its final phrase and they slowed with it, the movement drawing to its close, and he released her with the same deliberate care with which he had taken her. Nothing excessive, nothing withheld, just precise and considered and entirely itself. They stood for a moment at the edge of the floor. Around them, the room reoriented, new couples forming, the evening continuing its business without them. Someone laughed near the refreshments. The man in yellow breeches had moved from his column to somewhere Julia could no longer locate. The candles burned steadily. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. She considered. For not saying it. He was quiet for a moment, and then, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one passing quickly across his face and departing before it could be claimed. "The evening is not yet over," he said, and offered his arm again. And she took it. In the carriage home, her mother talked about who had been there, and what had been worn, and whether the flowers in the entrance had been fresh or a day old. Julia sat with her hands in her lap, and the darkness of London moving past the window, and said the right things at the right moments. Inside, she was still on the dance floor. His hand at her waist, the waltz. It confirmed something I already believed. She pressed her fingers together in her lap, and stared at the passing lamplight and understood, with the clear, unwelcome precision she had always been cursed with, that she was in considerably more danger than she had been this morning. Not from him. From herself. From the part of her that had looked up on the third turn and found him already looking and had not. Not even for a moment, not even in the interest of self-preservation, wanted to look away. The formal calls began the following week. Julia arrived at Wyndham House on a grey Thursday, with her mother, her maid, and the particular braced readiness of someone who had spent 3 days preparing for a conversation without knowing what shape it would take. Wyndham House revealed itself gradually, not aggressively grand, but the kind of large that accumulated room by room through high ceilings and deep fireplaces and long windows looking out onto gardens planned for permanence. The furniture was good and old, not fashionably replaced. Books everywhere, not for decoration, but actual books with broken spines and pages worn soft from use. She noticed that, filed it away. Alexander received them in the front drawing room standing, not because he had heard them on the stairs, she sensed, but because he simply was, not performing readiness, actually ready. He poured tea himself. His hands were very steady, she noticed that too. They spoke about nothing for a while. The weather, the cold, a concert at Almack's she had attended. He asked her opinion of it, the first time since this engagement began that anyone had specifically asked her opinion of anything. The soprano was technically accomplished, she said. But technically accomplished is not the same as moving, and they are often confused by people who prefer admiring to feeling. Her mother produced the faint expression that meant that was too sharp, Julia. Alexander set down his teacup and looked at her as though she had said something interesting rather than something inappropriate. "What's the difference?" he asked. "Admiring is what you do when something is correct. Feeling is what happens when something is true." Her mother exhaled almost imperceptibly. "That is the most precise thing anyone has said in this room in several years," Alexander said. Julia looked at him and found him looking back with an expression she was learning, carefully alive like a room where all the windows had been opened after a long winter. The calls continued twice weekly, the structure softened gradually. Not because the rules changed, because they learned them well enough to move fluidly inside them, like fluent speakers of a language, the mechanics invisible. He asked her questions, not polite ones, the kind designed to produce polite answers and keep silence at bay. Real ones, specific ones, questions that required her to actually think. "If you weren't expected to marry this autumn, what would you be doing?" She paused. "I would be in the Lake District. I would have gone in August and I would still be there now, walking in the early morning when the fog is still on the water." "Alone?" "Preferably." He nodded, as though that was a perfectly reasonable thing for a woman to want. "What about you?" she asked. She was getting better at asking in return. It had taken several sessions to understand that he wanted her to, that the questions were invitations to exchange, not performances of interest. "Somersetshire," he said. "Wyndham Hall. That's where you live. That's where I go when I need to think." "What do you need to think about?" A pause. "At the moment, less than usual." She didn't ask what had changed. She already suspected. And the suspicion sat in her chest like warmth she didn't entirely trust. On the fourth call, a Wednesday, rain hard against the windows, She asked the question she had been carrying since the first afternoon in her father's study. Her mother stepped out for 5 minutes, a brief errand, and Julia looked at the door closing and decided 5 minutes was enough. "Why me?" she said. He looked up from his teacup. "My father told me you refused 3 other arrangements. He said you requested me specifically. I want to know why." She expected deflection. The smooth, gracious non-answer that people of their class had elevated to an art form. She was braced for it. He set down his cup. "Because you are the only person I have met in 4 years of this society," he said, "who tells the truth when she thinks no one important is listening." Julia held his gaze and said nothing. The rain against the glass, the fire shifting. "That is a very specific reason," she managed. "I am a very specific person." She swallowed. "When did you—" She stopped. "How long have you known who I was?" "Long enough," he said quietly, "that the market was not an accident." The silence that followed was different from all the others. She heard the rain, her own breathing. The memory of her own voice, what a curiously ungraceful man. The sound of it replayed now from the inside of someone else's hearing. "You were there deliberately," she said. "I wanted to see you without the context, without the drawing rooms and the introductions. I wanted to see what you were like when you thought no one who mattered was watching. And what did you see? Someone who laughs easily and thinks quickly, who is unkind sometimes in the way that very intelligent people are unkind when they feel safe, not to wound, but because the observation arrives before the caution." The heat rose in her face. Not shame exactly, something more complicated than shame. "That is not a flattering portrait. It is an accurate one, and accuracy is worth considerably more than flattery." "I said something unkind about you," she said quietly. "You heard it, and you still—" "Yes." "Why?" A pause. The firelight moved across his face. "Because the same woman who said that also stopped and looked back. Twice. And the second time, she looked as though she was trying to solve something." Julia said nothing. Because he was right. Because the answer was that he was right about her in ways she hadn't been right about herself. The door opened. Her mother returned. "Dreadful rain. Shall I ask for more tea?" "Please," said Alexander. Julia looked at the window, the grey, determined London sky, and understood that the most dangerous conversation she had ever had sounded, from the outside, like absolutely nothing at all. The information came, as damaging information often did, through Charlotte. Charlotte Fairweather had many virtues: loyalty, warmth, the kind of practical good sense that made her excellent company in a crisis. She also had one consistent liability: she could not hold interesting information for more than 48 hours without it finding its way out. "I heard something," Charlotte said, over afternoon tea at the Fairweather townhouse, the tone that meant she had been holding it for closer to 72 hours and was in mild distress. "About what?" "About him." Julia put down her cup. "Mrs. Hartwell told my mother," Charlotte said, leaning forward slightly, "that the Duke of Wyndham was approached twice last season and once the season before. Lord Pemberton's younger daughter, the Alcott sisters separately, all 3 refused by him. Personally. Not through fathers or solicitors." Julia already knew this in outline, but the names made it real in a way the outline hadn't. "She was present for 2 of the refusals," Charlotte continued. "Apparently he told Lord Pemberton directly that his daughter was accomplished, but that he could not in conscience enter into a marriage where he knew the feeling would not develop equally on both sides." Julia turned that sentence over carefully. "I could not in conscience enter into a marriage where I knew the feeling would not develop equally on both sides." "Charlotte," she said slowly, "what do you know about the Devereux family, the previous Duke?" "Very little. He died some years ago before we came out. There was talk about the estate having difficulties, but always vague. Why?" "I'm not certain yet," Julia said. "I'm thinking." "You're always thinking," Charlotte said, not unkindly. "But Julia, truly, how do you feel about him?" Julia picked up her teacup, put it down without drinking. "I feel," she said carefully, "as though I have been reading a book in the wrong direction and have only just realized it." "Is that good?" "I genuinely don't know." She did what she always did when she couldn't think inside the house. She walked. The Ashford garden was not large, not in the way she imagined Wyndham Hall's grounds to be large, the kind where you could walk 20 minutes and feel genuinely far from anything. But it was laid out cleverly enough that moving slowly through it felt like more than the space suggested. She moved slowly. November had stripped the trees at the garden's edge of everything decorative. Their bare shapes stood honest against the pale sky, and she found she preferred them this way. Structure without ornament, the truth of things. 3 refusals. I could not in conscience mislead her. And then, long enough that the market was not an accident, two possibilities had been circling her since the drawing-room conversation, and she couldn't settle on one. The first, it was a kind of control. A test she hadn't consented to, designed to gather intelligence on her before she knew to perform for him. The behavior of a man who trusted nothing he hadn't personally observed. The second, it was the most honest thing anyone had ever done in relation to her. Going around all the machinery, the introductions, the vouchers, the careful social choreography, to find something real. She walked the garden path a third time and understood somewhere near the far wall that these two possibilities weren't mutually exclusive. And then she understood something else. He had gone to the market because he wanted the unguarded version of her, the real one. And what he had found, the laugh, the unkind comment, the guilty look back, had not turned him away. It had been the answer. Her hand pressed briefly against her mouth. She breathed. What do you do with someone who wanted the real version when you spent your whole life constructing a better one? The wind came through and moved the bare branches, and she stood in it and felt something shift in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. At dinner, her mother talked about wedding arrangements, dates, guest lists, the dress. Julia ate and said the right things at the right intervals. After dinner, when her mother had retired, her father poured 2 glasses of port, one for himself, one for her, which was irregular, and sat beside her rather than across. He called on me again this afternoon, her father said. Separately, before your mother arrived home. What did he want? He wanted to know whether you were happy. Her father paused. Not whether you were agreeable to the arrangement, whether you were happy. The fire, the quiet house, the port she wasn't drinking. What did you tell him? I told him I wasn't certain, and that I thought you were the better person to ask. Julia looked at the fire for a long time. I think, she said quietly, I'm beginning to be. Her father nodded, said nothing more, and that, she thought, was perhaps the most eloquent thing he had ever communicated to her. The letter was in her father's desk. She wasn't supposed to find it. She wasn't looking for it. She had gone to the study to return a book, correspondence between Walpole and various persons of the previous century, more interesting than expected, and she had set it on the corner of the desk and was turning to leave when she saw the edge of an envelope beneath a larger document. The return address stopped her. Wyndham Hall, Somersetshire, Devereux. Not Alexander. The handwriting was older, a different generation, a different duke. The house was quiet. Her mother upstairs, her father out. The clock ticked its indifferent measure. She picked it up. Dated 8 years ago, December 1806. She had been 11. Alexander would have been 19, just come into the title, or close to it. She unfolded it. My lord, I write to you as a man who has these last months come to understand that very little of what he built in his life will outlast him in the way he intended. The estate is sound. The title will pass cleanly. But there are matters of a more personal nature which I find I cannot leave unaddressed. You will know that our families have been bound in the old sense for 2 generations, your father and mine having made their arrangements in the way of their time. I do not write to renegotiate those arrangements. I write to ask for something rather different. I have a son who is in many ways better than I was at his age. He is serious where I was careless, measured where I was impulsive. He has learned, I think, through watching my failures more closely than I would have wished him to, that a man can have everything the world considers valuable and still live with the wrong kind of poverty. You have a daughter. She is, I believe, 3 years old. I have not met her, but I have been told by those who know your family well that she has her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and that she is already the kind of child who watches everything and misses nothing. I am not asking for a contract. I am asking for a consideration. That when the time comes, when your daughter is of age and my son is in need of someone who can truly see him, you will not foreclose the possibility simply because it arrived dressed as a suggestion rather than a demand. He does not know I am writing this. He would be horrified, and rightly so. But I am running out of time, and the things a father most wants for his child are not the things he can instruct or arrange. He can only at the last ask. Your humble servant, Edward Devereux, Duke of Wyndham. Julia read it twice. Then she stood without moving for a long moment and listened to the clock. She was 3 years old in this letter, a child described by a dying man to a father who had read these words, and she understood it now, fully, the certainty settling into her bones, kept them for 16 years. She watches everything and misses nothing. How had he known? How had a man who had never met her written a description she would have recognized at any age? because he knew his son, and he was looking for the opposite of himself. She refolded the letter along its original creases, replaced it exactly as she had found it, left the study and went upstairs and sat on her bed in the afternoon light, with her hands in her lap. What this meant was, the arrangement had begun not with a contract or a dowry calculation, but with a request. With a father dying, looking at what his son would need, and trying, inadequately, because all such attempts were inadequate, to give it to him across time. And Alexander had known. Not the letter itself, perhaps. She suspected he had never seen it, but something, some version, some reason why, when solicitors had brought him names, he had looked at hers and felt something different. Not obligation, recognition. She found him alone for 12 minutes on a Thursday, her mother occupied in the hallway, the maid tactfully distant. "Your father wrote to my father 16 years ago," she said without preamble. A small tightening at the corner of his eye. "I know," he said. "You've always known." "I found out 2 years ago, when I was going through his papers. And then you went to the market. And then I wanted to be certain I wasn't honoring a dead man's wish at the expense of a living woman's happiness." The words changed the temperature of the room. "That is why you refused the others," she said. "You were waiting to see whether the description was accurate." "Yes." "And was it?" He looked at her. "I have not once since I entered this engagement doubted that it was." The warmth in her chest was not something she was managing to ignore anymore. She looked at the window, breathed, looked back. "He wrote that I watched everything and missed nothing," she said, "and I walked past you in a market and missed everything. You missed what I wanted you to miss, and saw what I couldn't hide." "What was that?" "That I had gone there to see you." A pause. "That I was nervous." She stared at him. "You were nervous?" "Extremely." "You didn't look nervous." "No," he agreed. "I rarely do. It's something of a curse." She looked at him, this composed private man who had carried a dead father's hope for 2 years, who had gone to a morning market alone and stood still among the flowers and waited to see what she was. And the door inside her swung open further than it had gone before. "Alexander," she said. It was the first time without the title. She hadn't planned it. He went very quiet. Not the composed quiet, a different kind, an arrested kind. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I said in the market. I know you have told me it doesn't matter, but it matters to me, and I want you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I have known for some time." Her mother's voice in the hallway, the door beginning to open. Julia turned to the window and pressed her lips together and thought, "I don't think I am only beginning to be happy. I think I am already there, and I only just noticed." The betrayal came from the direction she least expected. Not her mother, manageable, predictable, a force of nature that moved in known patterns. Not her father, who had, she now understood, been quietly on her side for longer than she had realized. It came from Frederick. Her brother was 22, handsome in the easy way of men who had never been told no, and in debt in the specific way of men who had been told yes too many times by people who wanted something in return. Julia loved him the way you loved someone who had been part of your childhood, with a kind of bedrock affection that the adult version didn't always earn, but still received as a matter of inheritance. She hadn't known how deep the debt went. She hadn't known until the night of the Carlisle dinner that Frederick had been speaking to Lord Harwick. Lord Harwick was everything Alexander was not. Loud in the way insecure men were loud, filling rooms with sound to prevent any silence that might require reflection. Handsome in an expensive, deliberate way that required maintenance and would fade badly. He had wanted Julia for 2 seasons, and her father had managed him out of consideration with the smooth efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting his daughter from without ever explaining it to her. She had seen Harwick twice this season. At the Pemberton ball, where he watched her arrive on Alexander's arm with an expression she noted and filed away without yet having a frame for it. At a musicale, where he positioned himself close enough for pleasantries, while remaining technically within acceptable conduct. Both times she had felt something, not fear, not exactly, but the particular alertness of someone who enters a room and finds the furniture has been rearranged slightly. Everything looks correct, but something is off, and she can't immediately place it. She understood it now. Charlotte arrived at Ashford House on a grey Tuesday, with red cheeks from the cold, and a look Julia had never seen on her before. Not the mild distress of manageable gossip, something tighter, genuine worry. "I need to speak to you alone," Charlotte said before she had even removed her bonnet. Julia took her upstairs, closed the door. Charlotte sat on the edge of the settee and pressed her gloved hands together. Your brother has been meeting with Lord Harwick, more than once. My brother saw them last week at White's, and then again on Tuesday evening at a private address in Mayfair that he—" She stopped. "It is not the kind of address that suggests the meetings are social." "What kind does it suggest?" Charlotte hesitated. "The kind where money changes hands, or promises of money." The fire in the small grate, the grey light at the window. Julia let the pieces assemble themselves. Frederick's debt, Harwick's interest, a private address in Mayfair. He's making some arrangement with Harwick. About me. Charlotte said nothing, which was the loudest confirmation she could have offered. "Has your brother heard anything specific?" "Only that Harwick believes the Wyndham engagement is not yet final, that it could be disrupted." Charlotte looked at her hands. "Julia, I'm so sorry. I don't know what Frederick told him, or what he—" "It's all right," Julia said. It was not all right. But the kind of not all right it was required calm and precision, and she had learned, from a lifetime of managing things alone, that calm was a tool, and this was a moment that required it. After Charlotte left, Julia sat in the upstairs sitting room while the fire burned down and she didn't feed it. Frederick. She kept coming back to Frederick, his easy laugh, the way he borrowed from her pin money and forgot he had done it, the way he moved through the world assuming the floor would hold because it always had. She wasn't angry. Not yet. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated than anger. The particular sadness of watching someone you love reach for the wrong solution because they are too frightened to look for the right one. And then she thought about Alexander, about what it would mean if this worked, if Harwick found a way to fracture the engagement before the final contracts were signed. She thought about what it would cost him, not the title, not the estate, those would survive, but something else. The thing a man spent 2 years protecting before he extended it, his trust. She stood up, fed the fire, went downstairs to find her father. She told him what Charlotte had told her, Harwick, Frederick, the private address, clearly, without softening it. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known about Frederick's debts?" "Long enough. I didn't know how much." He moved to the window in the way he did when he was arranging his thoughts, his reflection in the dark glass careful, composed. She saw, with a slight shock, how much of her own stillness under pressure she had inherited from him. "I will handle Frederick," he said. "That is not what I'm asking. Can Harwick actually disrupt the engagement?" "He cannot." Direct, certain. "The agreements with Wyndham are further progressed than Harwick knows. There is nothing he can disrupt legally." A pause. "What concerns me is whether he intends to try through other means." "What other means?" "Rumour," her father said simply. "The currency of people who have no legitimate instruments available to them." She thought about Alexander, the controlled privacy of him, the careful distance from performance. How much a man like that would hate to be the subject of rumour, not for his pride, but for the sheer waste of it. How quiet, in society, looked like guilt. He would not defend himself. He would simply go quiet. She was not going to let that happen. She told him on the following Thursday. Not softened, not performed. She told him what Charlotte had told her, and she watched his face as she spoke, the surface holding, as it always held, but a line appearing briefly between his brows, the slight shift of his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, fingers closing, then releasing. Small things. She had learned to read small things. When she finished, he was quiet. "How long have you known?" he asked. 2 days. "Why didn't you?" He stopped. "You went to your father first." "I wanted to know the legal ground before I brought it to you. I didn't want to bring you a problem. I wanted to bring you information." He looked at her for a long moment. Something cracked very slightly in his composure, brief and real and unmistakable. The expression of a man being genuinely surprised by someone, which she had not seen on him before, and which made him look, for one unguarded second, younger than he usually did. "Julia," he said. "Just her name." "Harwick has been managed before," he said after a moment. "What concerns me is your brother. Frederick is weak in the way people are weak, when they have never been asked to be strong. I don't believe he is malicious. That makes him more dangerous, not less. Malicious people are predictable. Frightened ones are not." She added it to the collection. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I have already done it." She looked at him. "I became aware of the situation 3 days ago," he said quietly. 3 days ago. 1 day before Charlotte came to her door, 1 day before she went to her father. He had known first, he had moved first, and he had said nothing, not to alarm her, not to preempt her own discovery, not to arrive before she had the chance to meet it herself. "What did you do?" she asked. "I had a conversation with Frederick, private, quiet." He looked at her steadily. "He is no longer in debt." The fire, the room, her mother's pen moving at the window. "You paid his debts." "The debts Harwick was using as leverage, yes." "Without telling me." "Without telling you." A pause. Something moved through his expression, more visible than usual, less contained. "Because I did not want you to feel managed. I did not want you to feel that I had acted on your behalf in a way that diminished you." Julia looked at him. He protected her, and then stepped back so she would never feel protected against her will. "I don't feel diminished," she said. The words came out quietly, not the performed gratitude of someone who had been rescued. She had no interest in performing gratitude. Just 3 words, stated plainly, the way he stated things. True, because they were true. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they had built between them in this room. Those silences were comfortable, familiar, the easy quiet of 2 people who had learned they didn't need to fill the space. This one had weight in it, a kind of held breath that neither of them named. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were still on the arms of the chair, perfectly still now, none of the small shifts of before. His eyes on hers with an attention so complete it was almost a physical thing, almost something she could feel from across the width of the tea table. His jaw moved slightly, a breath taken and released slowly. "Good," he said. One word, low enough that it was almost only for the room itself, for the fire and the afternoon light and the space between them. And in that single word was everything he didn't say. The months of careful construction, the market and the coat and the wildflowers, the 2 years of waiting for a description to prove itself accurate, and the 3 days of knowing about Frederick and saying nothing and trusting her to find her own way to him. All of it folded into one word. Good. Her mother set down her pen at the window. "Shall I ask for more tea? It's gone cold." "Please," said Alexander. Julia turned to the window. The winter London sky. The bare plane trees on the street below stripped and honest against the grey. She pressed her thumbnail lightly against her forefinger, a small, private thing, an anchor, and breathed. She was in very considerable trouble. She had been for some time. And she found, sitting in that drawing room with cold tea and a man who had paid her brother's debts and said nothing about it, that she no longer had any interest in getting out. They were married on a Thursday. It seemed right. Their day, the day of drawing rooms and tea and 12-minute silences that had become over 3 months the most honest conversations Julia had ever had with another person. She didn't say this to anyone. It would have sounded small. It was enormous. The ceremony was at the chapel at Ashford House, small and cold and smelling of old stone and hothouse lilies. She stood beside Alexander in the pale January light and said the words that changed the shape of her life, and his hand around hers was steady. Of course it was steady, but when she turned to look at him at the moment the minister asked for his declaration, she found something in his face the composure didn't quite cover. Not nerves, something older. The expression of a man arriving at last somewhere he had been travelling toward for a long time. They arrived at Wyndham Hall 3 days later. The carriage turned through gates bearing the Devereux crest in weathered iron, and Julia pressed her face to the cold window and watched the estate appear out of the grey January landscape. Large but not aggressive, stone the colour of old honey in winter light, the grounds bare, January having stripped them of everything decorative, and in their bareness she could see the shape of them, the bones of the landscape, the way the garden had been planned not for a single season but for permanence. She thought of the Ashford garden, the deliberate smallness of it, the effort visible in every corner. This was a garden built to be lived in, not admired. Alexander showed her through the house himself. No housekeeper tour, no formal introduction to rooms in the proper sequence, just the 2 of them moving through the corridors in the low afternoon light, his hand brushing door frames he had known since childhood, pausing at things he wanted her to see, not because protocol required it, but because he wanted her to see them. "This was my father's study," he said at one door. "I use it sometimes, not often." "Because it was his?" "Because it faces north, I prefer the morning light." She smiled. She was getting better at smiling at him without feeling she was giving something away. It was a recent development. She was still adjusting to it. He showed her the library last. 2 stories high, accessible by an iron staircase that curved rather than rose straight, and every shelf full the way working libraries were full, accumulated over generations of actual use, not arranged for appearance. She walked into the middle of it and turned slowly and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't known was unsettled. "I will live in this room," she said. "I thought you might," he said. and he sounded genuinely, quietly pleased, the way he sounded when something confirmed what he had already believed, and the confirmation still mattered. That evening they sat in the smaller of the two sitting rooms, not the formal one, the one where the house clearly actually breathed. The fire was high, the winter dark pressed against the windows. A servant brought supper on trays rather than setting the formal table, which Julia suspected was a household adaptation, to a man who found formal dinners an inefficient use of an evening. She ate, watched the fire, let the particular quality of the silence settle around her. It was familiar now, this silence. She had stopped bracing against it weeks ago. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask it." "The flowers." She looked at him. "At the market, the wild flowers you bought, who were they for?" She had carried the question for months. She had told herself it might be his mother, a grave, something entirely mundane, that she had constructed significance around because she was the kind of person who did that. She needed the real answer. Alexander looked at the fire for a moment, then at her. "There is a room in this house," he said. "At the end of the east corridor. It was my mother's sitting room. I have kept it as she had it." Julia waited. "I leave flowers in it when I come back from London." She preferred wild flowers to arranged ones. She said they were honest. "So they were for her," Julia said softly. "They were for her." A pause. "But the day I went to the market was the day I told my father's solicitor to proceed, to contact Lord Ashford, to begin." He looked at her steadily. "I went to see you first, and then I brought her flowers." A beat. "In my mind, the two things were connected." Her breath came out slowly. "You were telling her," she said, "in whatever way one tells things to people who are no longer there to hear them." "Yes." The fire crackled. Outside, the January wind moved across the Somersetshire grounds. She looked at him, this private, careful, quietly extraordinary man, and felt something open in her chest that was not frightening and not painful, but simply finally the feeling of something that had been held closed for a very long time letting go. "I laughed at you," she said quietly. "I saw you in that market, this man who was clearly something, and I looked at the coat and decided in 3 seconds that you were nobody." "You decided what the coat suggested," he said, "not what the man was, and you revised that conclusion quickly." "I called you ungraceful." "You also looked back," he said, "twice." "That's not an absolution." "No, but it is accurate." She looked at her hands in her lap, looked up. "I have spent 3 months expecting you to become smaller," she said, "the way people do when you see them consistently. They become more ordinary, more knowable." "Manageable," he offered. "Yes," she held his gaze, "you don't." The corner of his mouth shifted, barely. A warmth she had learned to read the way you learn to read weather, slowly and with attention, until you could feel the change before it arrived. "Neither do you," he said. The fire settled in the grate. The house was quiet around them. The kind of quiet that didn't need filling, that was its own kind of answer. Julia looked at him, her husband, this man of worn coats and wildflowers and carefully carried hopes, and she thought of a September morning smelling of rain and chrysanthemums, a market, a coat, a smile she hadn't been meant to see. "Alexander," she said. He looked at her. "I would like to see the room, at the end of the corridor, if that is something you would allow." A pause. Something passed through him that she felt more than saw, a door he opened quietly, without announcement. He rose, held out his hand. She took it. They walked together through the quiet house, through the long corridor where the lamps burned low and the shadows were soft and unhurried, and he opened a door at the end and stood back so she could enter first. The room was small, warm. It smelled of dried lavender and old wood, and underneath both something lighter, wildflowers, recent enough to still carry their scent. A writing desk near the window, a reading chair beside the fireplace, a painting above the mantel, a woman with dark eyes that had clearly passed themselves to her son, and on the corner of the desk, a small vase. Winter flowers, pale, simple, the kind that pressed well between the pages of books, 3 days old perhaps, brought from London, tucked under the arm of a man in a travelling coat. Julia stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. "She would have liked you," Alexander said behind her very quietly. "How do you know?" "Because she liked honest things, and you are one of the most honest people I've ever known, even when the honesty is inconvenient." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know over 3 months of Thursdays and silences, the one that went all the way in rather than across. The one she had spent weeks learning to read, and would spend years, she suspected, still discovering new things inside. "I came into this engagement not knowing you," she said. "I know." I came in thinking I would manage it, learn the shape of it, make it workable. And she looked at the flowers, at the painting, at the lamplight making the room small and warm and entirely itself. And instead, she said, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. He was quiet for a moment. What was that? He asked carefully, as though the answer mattered enough to be careful with. She looked at him. Someone who already knew the worst version of me, she said, and came anyway. The lamp flickered, the lavender, the winter dark at the window. He reached out and took her hand, not formally, not the offered arm of a drawing room or a ballroom, but simply her hand, his fingers closing around hers, the way you held something you intended to keep. I came, he said quietly, because the worst version of you looked back. Her throat was tight. She let it be tight. I would have run, she said, her own voice from the prologue circling back to her now, if I had known. I know. I'm glad I didn't. His thumb moved across the back of her hand. Once, slow. The way he did everything, without hurry, without wasted motion, with the full attention of a man who had decided something mattered. So am I, he said. The room held them both in its quiet. The flowers on the desk, the woman in the painting watching with her son's dark eyes, the lamplight casting long, unhurried shadows across the walls. Julia looked up at him, and she thought that she had been wrong about so many things in her life, and right about so few, and this man standing beside her in his mother's room with winter flowers on the desk between them was the one she intended to spend the rest of her life being right about. She leaned forward just slightly, a small, deliberate thing. He lowered his head toward hers just as slowly. When his lips met hers, it was not the performance of a first kiss. It was not hesitant. It was not tentative in the way of people who do not yet know what they are to each other. It was quiet and warm and entirely certain. The way you arrived somewhere, you had been traveling toward for a long time. Wyndham Hall, 3 years later. The morning light came in sideways through the tall windows of the sitting room, soft and silver. Julia sat at her writing desk and held a letter in both hands without reading it. She had written it herself, never sent it. It was not the kind of letter that needed a recipient. It was the kind you wrote to make the shape of a thing visible to yourself, to see it from the outside, the way you couldn't when you were still inside it. I was wrong about you from the very first moment. I was wrong about everything. Outside, his voice, low and unhurried, giving some instruction to someone below. The sound of it reached her across the morning the way it always did, finding her before she had turned toward it, the way familiar things do when you have lived alongside them long enough. She folded the letter, tucked it into the small wooden box beside the inkwell, closed the lid. Then she rose and went downstairs, and out through the back door into the cold January morning, where the air was sharp and clear, and the light made everything look newly arrived. He was at the far edge of the garden. He heard her before she reached him. He always did, and turned. She crossed the garden toward him through the pale winter grass, the bare trees at the edge, the pale sky, the estate stretching wide and permanent behind him, as though the house itself had grown from the ground and always intended to be here. He waited, as he always waited, without hurry, without performance. When she reached him, he said nothing and she said nothing, and he offered his arm and she took it, and they turned together toward the morning. She thought about a September market, about a coat and a bundle of wildflowers, and a smile she had not been meant to see, about a woman who had laughed, and a man who had heard, and the precise, unhurried, improbable thing that had grown from that moment like something planted long before either of them was watching. She had been wrong about so many things. She pressed her hand slightly against his arm. He covered it with his own without looking down. Warm, steady, real. And she walked with him into the morning, into the cold and the light and the good, quiet life they had built. From a beginning she had almost missed entirely. That was the whole of the story. And it was, in the way of things that do not need to be more than they are, exactly enough.
I saw you once in morning light, a stranger dressed in quiet grace.
I laughed before I understood the truth I couldn't face. A passing glance, a fleeting breath,
something in the way you stood, refused to pass me by.
And I did not know what I had seen until it stayed inside of me. Before I knew your name, you knew my soul. Before I turned away, you saw me whole. And every careless word I gave still led me back to you. Before I knew your name, you already knew. I went to find what truth remained beyond the masks they always wear, and found you there between the noise. Unaware, I stood there. You spoke as though the world was yours, unfiltered, bright and wild and free. And in that single honest flaw, you were revealed to me.
And I had known
From that first day, you were the one who would not fade. Before I knew your name, you knew my soul. Before I turned away, you saw me whole. And every careless word I gave still led me back to you. Before I knew your name, you already knew. I thought I'd learn to play the part, I thought I'd never feel. But something broke inside the dark. We were written long before we ever chose to begin.
before I knew your name,
You knew my heart.
before I understood.
We'd never part. And all the roads I never saw were